I'll try to speak good and loud so everybody can hear me. If you can't hear me, just say, huh? But I'm delighted to be here. I want to thank Dave and I want to thank Paul Lappin, the Parker series, for having me come to St. Patrick's Church, speak about the connection with the Irish, Patrick Keely, how it came to be, and how all this came to be in Lowell. This really is, I look around, one of the treasures still left in the Archdiocese of Boston. Many of your older churches have been stripped of their ecclesiastical furnishings. And there are a few down in Connecticut that they took everything out. Stations, statues, altars, altar rail, put a butcher block altar up in the front here and said, "Welcome to church." And the young people say, well, I could go to a bank and see the same thing. How did Patrick Keely, an architect from Brooklyn, who was born in Thurles, Tipperary, ever get to come up to Lowell? Well, they're varied and wide connections. Patrick Keely married he came in 1842. He was 25 at the time. And about 1847, Father Malone, an Irishman down in Brooklyn, needed some work to be done at St. James Church. So he heard about Keely and he got him to come in and superintend an addition to the church and some interior embellishments. There's a picture over there that shows it. And so that's how Keely got his start. Then it just went from there to there. When the Irish were in Ireland, there were certain things that they were not allowed to do. They weren't allowed to speak their language. They weren't allowed to own property. They weren't allowed to vote. And God forbid, with the English church, they were not allowed to practice their faith. So when you look at these structures, they were built by especially here in Lowell, they were built by the pennies and the dimes of the people that worked in the mills. It was a long and grinding affair. Now, my own grandfather, I have a connection with Lowell, even though I'm from Enfield, Connecticut, because the Lowell carpet company, or I guess it was a manufacturing company, was up here, and in Enfield was the Hartford Carpet Company. And Hartford bought Lowell, and they moved everybody down to Enfield, or Thompsonville, high class now, we have to call it Enfield. But it was Thompsonville then. And eventually it became known as the Bigelow Sanford Carpet Company. You might have heard of that back in the 40s and 50s, we who are older. I don't even know if they still exist. About the 70s, they closed the plant and moved down to South Carolina where labor was cheap. But he went to work at 11, so you can understand how people accomplish things. He didn't have an education if he went to work at age 11. But by 1923, 24, he became the wool buyer for Hartford Carpet Company, which at the time had about 4,000 employees. And here was this guy from Glenesh, County Galway. That's the Gaelic for Glenski. Everybody says it sounds like it's Polish, but it isn't. I've been there. It's just a little burg on the inlet of the sea. And he came over here and he made his name, and he went to work at Bigelow. Dave was doing something, I don't know what he was doing, so he was distracting me. But in 1923-24, he was sent by the Hartford Carpet Company, later the Bigelow Sanford, to France, Ireland, Scotland, to buy $1.2 million worth of wool. Now, you had to be pretty sharp. How did a guy that started working at 11, picking up things around a factory, do this? We don't know. The same way with Patrick Keely. How did a guy that came from Thurles, Ireland, came over here with nothing. He just had an inclination in art. We don't know what his father did. We know it's listed in the annals of the parish over in Thurles as he and an uncle were what they called sawyers, were carpenters. And that's all basically we know. And surprisingly, over there it also says there were two, Keely was the original name, Kiely. And when they came into New York, of course, Ellis Island wasn't there, but it was changed. Things were changed. And he had a brother, William. For some reason, William went down to Bardstown around Louisville, Kentucky, and started building down there. And he did the Immaculate Conception Cathedral in Louisville. And Patrick settled in Brooklyn. Now, as I said, the Irish couldn't celebrate their faith or have Mass over in Ireland. So when they came here, they were just absolutely delighted. So they gave their pennies, and he began his first church, St. Peter and Paul's in Brooklyn. And from there, because it was such a big event when it was constructed, it was just a brick building, nowhere near the size of this, with a steeple on it, that all the priests in surrounding areas, and in those days, back in the 1850s, people traveled a long way to get to a church. And when a church was dedicated, priests and bishops came from a very long way. So when he came there, the bishop McCluskey that he knew from the area went up to Albany, and in 1852 he built the Albany Cathedral. In Boston, this is how he got to Lowell, there's a church, St. Peter and Paul's on Broadway, if you know Broadway, South Boston. It's now condominiums. It was built in granite, and it was built by an architect, Gridley Bryant. But about 1848, I don't have the date, there was a fire at some warehouses in South Boston. Now there's two stories to the whole thing, as there often is in this period. Because in this period, and many in New England and New York, we had what was the Know Nothing Party. They were like the Ku Klux Klan of the 40s and 30s. And there was a fire in the warehouses, and sparks flew and caught, even though it was quite a distance, they didn't have any really decent apparatus. Sparks flew, and
I know you
attention, okay, so people can hear? Good.
Yeah, we can hear that.
Good. Sparks flew, and the church burnt. Some say it was the lack of response from the firemen. Others say it was just a cause that happened. At the time, in the Diocese of Boston, was a vicar general named William Byrne. William Byrne was a cousin to Patrick Keeley's wife, Sarah Farmer. So when they needed somebody to rebuild the church, they wanted a Catholic, and there wasn't many Catholics around, and they wanted Irish Catholic. There wasn't any others around except the Irish. So they got Keely to come to rebuild St. Peter and Paul's. And the structure you see on in South Boston on Broadway is the same structure that Keely rebuilt. The inside has been turned into condominiums. But some of the condominiums, when you go into them, they have the arches up in the living rooms, so it's pretty grand looking. And a few of them have stained glass windows that were left in the choir loft, which irk a number of Catholics in South Boston, but that was up to the Archdiocese of Boston. So that's how he came, and he got familiar with Archbishop Fitzpatrick, and then churches started going up around here. And the first one around here that the first thing that Keely did, he did, maybe some of you remember it, I've never seen it, I've only seen a postcard of it, St. John's Hospital. It was an old Victorian building with a chapel inside. Well, Keely did that building, and he did the chapel. Now, how he got to do big, huge buildings like that, there must have been stepping stones in between, and there were down in Brooklyn, but we're interested in Lowell. And when that was done, the Oblates of Mary were here. They had come down from Canada, and there was a father, Garin, and his statue was outside St. Jean Baptiste. And Father Garin wanted to contact somebody to build a church, Immaculate Conception. And so the Archbishop recommended Patrick Keely to do it. Patrick Keely had already done a number of churches by, I think the period is about 1875 now, and he had done probably 30 or 40 churches in the Brooklyn, New York, Connecticut area. And so Father Garin contacted him, and they met. Now, Father Garin had superiors for the Oblates in Canada, but he also had superiors over in France. And he contacted Keely, and Keely said he needed a church for 1,500 people. They needed a church as quick as possible, so the basement church would be built, the upper structure would be built, and then it would be finished. Now, Keely was really held in high esteem by pastors because if they wanted a big church, and he said it's going to cost $4,000 for the granite for the whole church, he would get a quote from the granite quarries. And some of the granite around here came from Acton. There's another place some of it came from too, close by. And if the church didn't go up to 4 years, Keely would make the granite company stick to that price. So with woodwork and with anything that had to be done, the priests liked him because they knew they could count on, if you build a house or you do something today, you change your boiler from oil and gas like I did, well, they quote you $700 for this, and then all of a sudden when you get the bill, it's $900. Things have gone up, we couldn't get it because of this. But they liked him because of that. The Oblates of Mary were driven nuts by Patrick Keely. He had a method to his madness, though. He would only give them plans one at a time because he knew if he gave them the plans for the basement, the building of the walls, the first floor structure, the granite walls and the structure for the interior part of the building, and all the accoutrements that were going to come in there, inside in there, they'd just get somebody else that might be cheaper. But he wasn't an expensive guy. But Patrick Keely, and some of you might understand this because you might come from big families, when he married Sarah Farmer in the 1850s, eventually, by the 1870s, she died in 1872, they had a total of 19 children. Now, there were 3 sets of twins. Only one of them lived to be appreciable age. And you have to remember, back in those days, only 11 lived to be any kind of an age. And even John and Charles, who both worked on St. Mary's in Charlestown, St. Mary's in the North End, Holy Trinity German Church, which is now closed, and a few other churches around Boston. They died in their 20s and 30s. Charles was a big man, and they called it robust in those days, but he got pneumonia. But aspirin wasn't invented till 1890, so if you had a baby that caught cold, and it was in a deep sweat, and you were giving it liquids, and you were hugging it and keeping it warm and doing everything you could, it just died. There was nothing, there was no medicines. And when the Irish came here, they couldn't afford to have large families. in Ireland. They just didn't have the nutrition and everything when they came here. There was the opportunity. So that's how Patrick Keely came to have 19. A number of them were architects. Now, he built St. Patrick's Church here. He built St. Peter's Church, was one of his last cathedral-sized churches up on Gorham Street. He did St. Michael's, I guess you call it Centerville. He did Sacred Heart. I don't know what the connection with there is. I think it's more with Tom Houghton. He also had, there are designs of Patrick Keely that were in the original St. Jean Baptiste, but that burned too shortly around the time that St. Patrick's had a fire. And that was rebuilt by another fellow. Let's see, which I'm missing, there's 5 of them. St. Peter's, St. Patrick's, Sacred Heart. Oh, the Immaculate. That's the one we were talking about. So the Immaculate went slow but sure. So the Oblates were infuriated because they could never get plans out of him. And it's in their annals that tells about how they would write, their superiors in Canada would saying, you know, why aren't you doing your job? We told you we needed the complete plans by last month. We are getting letters from France saying the Superior General in France needs plans to see what is happening over in the United States. So it still went on, and they said, you know, we like him because he gives you a quote of price and things still stay the same. We don't like him because he won't give up the plans. And they called him a lazy, stubborn man, which he was, and he was just being, he was watching out for himself. I guess with all the kids he had to. Now, there are 3 designs similar to St. Patrick's here that are around. This was 1870, this was 1854. Another design that was a little more grand than St. Patrick's is in Albany, New York. It was St. Joseph's. It was built in 1855 by Patrick Keely. The tower is the same, the side walls are the same, has deeper transepts, but it has 3 spires, 1 on the front and 2 on the back. That closed sometime back in the early 90s. The bishop at the time in Albany offered it to anybody that would take it, and it was pretty much left intact inside. Well, it languished for a long while, and then they let people other parishes take pews, take some altars, pulpits, altar rail, things like that. And then it was sold to a restaurateur that was going to make it into a banquet hall. She owed money to the city of Albany, and her son decided to take it over for a Limelight Cafe or something. And the city of Albany said, oh, wait a minute. Historic Albany said, no, we're not going to let that happen. So Historic Albany took it over, and now it still has the murals in, it still has the stained glass. Their whole structure was coming down. It was much worse than St. Peter's. It was all coming down. This column was collapsing, and the roof was sagging right there. Historic Albany got enough money to have the whole thing done over. So that church has been preserved. The other church that is similar in design, if you go to Taunton, Mass, is St. Mary's. Does anybody know St. Mary's Church in Taunton? If you look at it, minus the spire, it looks like the same church. Inside, it's a little different. So Patrick Keely got his connection to Lowell through the Diocese of Boston, and he, as I said, he would come and he would hire local people to do things. I have the paper. There was a firm, I think it's Merrimack Street. Welch was the name of it. They were, and we have the letterhead with information on it for things they used at the cathedral. They did furniture and draperies, but they also did for a number of churches pew ends, confessionals, any woodwork that Keely needed to be done, wainscoting like that, because they had the carpenters that could do it one after the other. You know, if you look at the quatrefoil that goes around the wainscoting here, it's just a quatrefoil that repeats itself. You often see that in Keely churches. Some of the churches had wooden fronts to their choir loft, and they would do that too. The marble came, there was an importer in Boston, Charles Hall, and he was connected, also had a partner at one time, Michael Moran, another Irish name. And they were on Charlestown Street that was obliterated by the federal building in Boston. They imported the various stones for altars. Charles Hall would then have the marble shipped to New York to a company by Thies and Thrug, and they would do the designs according to the architect. Now this altar here and the two side altars, after the church burned, the original altar, as many of you know from St. Patrick's, downstairs, is used as the main altar. But when St. Patrick's burned in 1905, Patrick Keely was dead, but his son-in-law, Thomas Houghton, carried on the business with another son, William Keely. There were churches to be finished, and there were a few churches around New England that did burn. Another one similar to this, with windows by the same company, was St. Mary's in New Britain. That was a fire caused by an explosion of a furnace, and it was about 1905 also. So they were able to call upon the firm to come back, and they knew the structure of the building, so it had a semblance to the original building that had burned. But they wanted something a little more different, so there was a German carver that Keely had used at some of the cathedrals, used it at St. Peter's and other places around here. His name was Joseph Sibyl. If you go into St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, in the transepts, there are 4 Latin doctors seated in a large niche on the wall, and there's 4 Greek doctors on this side over here. Joseph Sibyl, did the altars that you see here that are extremely unique. And it was, I have the newspaper article that tells about it, that, in fact, I might have it in front of me. Yeah, this is from the Boston Globe. And if you'll permit me just to tell you about that, if I can find the glasses that I had. From the Boston Globe, it says, all the sculptured work of the altars was prepared by Joseph Sibyl of New York, and before being sent to Italy, were presented to the architect for approval. The sculptured work includes all the panels in the main altar, all the panels of the side altar, the statues of St. Joseph and St. Patrick on the main altar. There are also statues of St. Peter and Paul over the main altar. And then it goes on to describe it. And you can see the 2 statues of St. Peter and Paul. Originally, they were not painted in any color. It's what Joseph Sibyl described as ivory tint. Those are plaster, the rest are marble. So they're quite unique. Over here on this side, we have the Blessed Virgin, Our Lady of the Rosary, as she became known, giving the rosary to St. Dominic. On this side, we have the Sacred Heart appearing to St. Margaret Mary. And there's 2 angels on each side. And from information from the Seibel Studios, when he carved the angels, it was hard to carve angels with wings going up because he would carve it from one piece of marble. And it was difficult to ship them because quite often, if you weren't careful, the one wing would break off and they'd have to do some repair on it. So he didn't like to do that. He liked to do them closer to the body. So you have some unusual pieces of marble here that are really outstanding. So that's some of the background on the Charles Hall from Boston. That's the connection to the altars. Now, if people have questions, just raise your hand and I'll answer them for you as I speak. There's nothing sacred about what I have to say. After a while, I hear my voice and I feel like I'm droning on about nothing. The window, yes. I think it's 1903. No, 1907. The church burned in. I'll get it for you. Come up afterwards and I'll have it. Yeah. But it's on 1903, the Boston. Pardon? The Chapel of St. John's, yes. Pardon?
You know when they closed them, when it went out of use, that was supposed to be beautiful.
No, maybe somebody here remember. Do you remember the old St. John's Hospital? When did they tear that down? In the 50s, the 40s, or later?
Later than that. It was built, well, it's now the old building. It was built in 1965.
Okay.
It was still in use then. I was born in the old building. I still remember some being in there with my asthma attacks.
Do you remember the chapel?
No, I don't.
No, you don't. So I don't know about the chapel. See, because Keely first came here because of Father Garin and the Oblates of Mary, and the first connection through the Archdiocese of Boston was the Immaculate and St. John's. He also did St. Joseph's. It was a smaller building, and they expanded it because they really needed a lot, and that was for the French community. And then he got, then from there, from the St. Joseph's sprang St. Jean Baptiste. And if you look at the window frames that are on St. John Baptiste now, which I guess is a community center, they mirror their exact designs of the same that Keely used on Immaculate Conception on Harrison Avenue in Boston. Also the doorways, too, the design of the doorways. Now, that was another thing. A lot of immigrants came and they were opening new parishes, and pastors wanted these grand buildings, and the people would go to one parish and say, "Oh, Father, we want one like that, we'll give our money." And when you look back and you remember St. Peter's and Lowell up on Gorham Street, when they were envisioning that, St. Peter's had 9,000 parishioners. So if they gave a quarter a week, that's a hunk of change. If they gave $1 at Christmas time, even if half of them came, a lot of churches don't get 4,000 a week now. Some of them do. The Immaculate I think is about, that's the only church I know anything from about here. Maybe other churches do well, like, depends upon where the church is situated. But it's really amazing, the things. Now, Patrick Keely, he did in his lifetime, and it seems exaggerated, but it isn't, nearly 700 churches. His largest church is in New Orleans, St. Joseph's. It's a huge church. It's the largest structure in the southern part of the largest ecclesiastical structure in the southern part of the United States. And during Hurricane Katrina, water surrounded it and got in the basement but didn't damage it. Now, a different architect began to build it. The Vincentians were the ones to build it. But the soil down there is all it's all like swamp and everything like that. So they weren't having much luck. So the Vincentians, who Keely had done St. Joseph Buffalo for, the cathedral up there, got a hold of him, see what he could do. And it was kind of ingenious. It's a brick structure, and with brick structure you use mortar. But if it's a damp area, what are you going to do to get the mortar to dry? They stuffed cotton. They had a lot of cotton down there, so they stuffed cotton in it, and that it dried. So he was very clever in doing these things wherever he went. The farthest church he did in the United States was in Watertown, Wisconsin. He did churches in Canada. He did the Church of the Yesu in Montreal, which is a Jesuit church. Everybody goes to see Notre Dame, which is a spectacular church. But if you go to the Yesu, that is just breathtaking. It's huge. It's Romanesque in design, but it's just breathtaking. He also did work in New Brunswick. He did St. Simon, St. Jude in Nova Scotia. He did all the original cathedrals of New England, most of them of New York. He didn't do St. Patrick's. He did the original St. Patrick's Cathedral enlargement, which is in the southern part of Manhattan. They call it St. Patrick's Old Cathedral. So if you go in there and you look around, you're going to see woodwork. I don't know if Welch from Lowell did the woodwork there, but it's the type of woodwork that Keely did. You can, when you see it, you know it. So it's just amazing. And these structures were built because of the Irish and because of the mills that were around here. As I said, the family, Tom Houghton, he married one of Keely's daughters. So he was Keely's son-in-law. Tom was kind of a stocky guy. I know this from family stories. He had red hair. He was great fun to one of Patrick Keely's daughters, Teresa, whose husband had died, and 3 of her 5 children had died. Her husband died, and she left Brooklyn, and she went out to Patchogue, Island to live. And she didn't want to remarry. The father wanted her to remarry. There's a picture of the Keely house in Brooklyn over there later on. But she didn't want to remarry, so she left, and she went out to Patchogue, Long Island. But if you're a woman with children, back in the 1870s, what are you going to do? So she opened a boarding house. So a lot of her relatives, like Tom Houghton, would come and stay with the family during the summertime. And Teresa Keely's, her name was Haggerty, but I'll call her Keely. Girls were little girls at the time. And Uncle Tom Houghton, that did this building after Keely died and did all the work inside it, the designs, and figured everything out after it had burned. They used to love him because he would take them out on the pond, not the ocean, but the pond there, and go rowing with them. And then he would tell them scary stories about there's creatures like Loch Ness Monster down in the water there, but put your hand down and maybe he'll come up. And if a fish came up and popped through the water, he would say there, and he'd start rowing faster, and the girls would start screaming, and they would sing and have a grand time. So it gives kind of a human touch to these people that, you hear the word Patrick Keely and his kids. Well, he lived first on Hudson Street, and the house is still there today. It's still cobblestone street that goes down in Brooklyn. It's right by the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and in the backyard of Keely's house, there is the Admiral's house that is this grand white colonial structure, and it looks like something that should be on, Martha's Vineyard or someplace on Chestnut Hill. but the house that he lived in is still there. But things changed like they changed here in Lowell, and they boarded up the first floor, and when I was there, they have a giant bullseye on the front of it. Why, I do not know. But that's where he originally lived. And there's very interesting stories. Teresa that I was just telling you about, and there's another connection to Teresa, because when she went back after a lot of the family died to Brooklyn, all the plans, people say, well, do you have the plans for this church? Do you have the plans for that church? All the plans that Patrick Keeley had, 3 sets of plans were made. He kept one in the office, one sometimes went to the diocese, to the bishop, and a third one went to the pastor. In those days, they didn't have big sheets of paper, so they did them on linen. So after architectural drawings, probably not the original, not the second church, Tom Hope, but maybe the original ones, they were hanging around here. They were on linen, and the Sisters of Notre Dame spied them and said, oh, we can bleach those and make altar cloths and things out of them. And that's exactly what happened to a lot of them, so they're not around. But the ones that were left in the office on Vanderbilt and DeKalb, and he could leave his backyard and cross over to his office without anybody seeing, so people wouldn't bother him. They had in the house, and Teresa in the late 20s, she was horrified of what was happening with all these wealthy people that lost things in the Depression, and she did not want her father's photographs, letters, or anything falling into secondhand shops, because everybody knew who he was in Brooklyn. So she went out in the backyard and had one grand bonfire, time after time after time, and got rid of it all. Some of it survived in the Brooklyn, when Keely died in 1896, another relative of the Sarah Farmer asked if she could have some of the plans. He asked, I'm getting my tenses, my male and female mixed up. Father McNamee, who built St. Teresa's Church, Keely did it, in Brooklyn, asked for plans. So he got the plans, he put them up in a tower in his church, and they were there. And when he died, the priest that came afterwards, contacted the the Diocese of Brooklyn and said, we have all these church plans that Keely did. They should be in the archives. Take them over the archives. Well, the archives got them, and they had them in, architectural big drawers like this, et cetera, et cetera. Sometime in the late 30s, early 40s, the Brooklyn Diocese said, let's have a tag sale. And so they never bothered to look in the drawers. So they sold these big architectural cabinets that you had big drawers on to a plumber in Flatbush, because plumbers have all these little parts. So he hauled them all the way to Flatbush, which is kind of a tough area now, but then it was pretty good. And when he got home, he started opening the drawers with the stuff, and he recognized all these church things. He said, this is a mistake. These shouldn't be here. So he gathered them all up, brought them back to the Brooklyn archives. Nobody knows what happened to them. So there are a few around. Boston has a few, and I have a few over here. There's a church in Brooklyn, St. John the Baptist, in Bed-Stuyvesant, and it shows Keely's drawings that were on linen. They still have them. It's in a book, a big book like this, and there are pages of linen. And I was able to copy them on a copy machine when we gave a Keely Congress down there a few years back. And so that the two boards over there show Keely plans and then shows how it came to fruition. And then over here there's some other plans. But constantly, you're getting calls from Keely churches, especially in New England. Could we have a copy of the Keely plans? You must have a copy. I don't have any copies. I have a few here and there, but they're gone. So with all those kids, what are you going to do with them? Well, Sarah Farmer, the mother, was quite a musician, and some of the kids became competent on musical instruments. So there were two things that happened after supper. The bigger boys went in the kitchen to this big, long Eastlake table that had 9 leaves in the kitchen. If you know antiques, you'll know the name Eastlake. And that eventually went to Patchogue when Teresa went there, and she had to sell it when she needed money because she was a single woman. But the older boys would go to the kitchen and they would copy drawings. I'm talking teenage boys would copy the drawings of their fathers, and that's how they got to learn the architectural business, because he had to have, like I said, 3 copies. And the younger kids went into the living room, and Sarah played the piano, and you didn't have radio, you didn't have TV, you didn't have internet, you had nothing. So you wanted the kids exhausted. So the kids would dance around, sing, have a grand old time, and all of a sudden it was time to go to bed. When the young girls were courting, 10 o'clock at night, Patrick would come to the top of the stairs and just yell down, like a father would, "Are you still at it?" And that was a signal to get out. And of course, in those days, still at it means just not what it means today. They were just sitting, talking, probably not even holding hands. And the boys will be boys. Here's another story. Now, these all come from, I know a lot of the family descendants, and so the stories have come down, and I have a whole fascinating booklet about 30 pages that tell about Teresa out on Patchogue, Long Island during the Spanish-American War. There was a railroad line that went from New York out to Montauk, and this is how the soldiers went out and then got on ships and went down to Cuba. And Teresa Keeley would go down with a basket of bread and goodies, whatever the women of the area, and all the women did, and would go down and wait for the train to stop, because there was a stop there because the steam trains needed water. And they would put the water in, and they'd give the things to the men on the men had come off, or they'd open the windows and they'd hand them things. And one day she was there with her daughter Teresa, and Teresa probably was only about maybe 5 or 6 at the time, and the soldier said to Teresa, the mother, "Could I hold her?" And she said yes, and she picked him up and she put him in the arms of the soldier. And young Teresa said years later, she never understood when she turned around why her mother was crying. She said she realized then that he wanted to hold the little girl because he probably would never see his little girl again, and he had a little girl like that. So there's interesting stories like that. And then there's fresh stories with the boys, who when the women, the young girls were in their teenage years, and I guess in those days, if they had their bus lines they wanted to pump bigger, they'd put tissue in. So one night after supper, one of the neighborhood kids, the Keely boys, said, "We think Essie has put a lot of tissue paper in her bosom. Here's a hat pin. Go stick her with it and see if she screams, we'll know it's right. If she doesn't scream, we'll know she stuffed it with tissue." Well, they did. And it must have been downstairs or on the front steps or something. And Essie let out a scream. Well, Patrick was furious. He threw them all out, told them not to come back, etc. So these are just lifetime stories from the 1870s that make family life interesting and sad and difficult. And as I said, he did all the cathedrals of New England. The cathedral in Boston is the only one that hasn't changed too much inside. It still retains its side altars and a magnificent main altar. It almost lost the main altar when Cardinal Law did the renovation. Bishop Murphy went down to Rockville Center, wanted it out. He said, "We don't have that anymore." Can you imagine taking out this altar here? but they did that in many churches, but it never happened. But the Hartford Cathedral burned. The Portland Cathedral they gutted it, took all the old things out. Providence has somewhat changed. Manchester has been stripped. I was up there last week. Burlington burned. And that's a story that is very interesting that I'll stop talking on. What time is it? Immaculate Conception Cathedral in Burlington, Vermont, was a granite structure similar to this, with a large tower off to one side. And the tower was unfinished, and the Bishop de Goosebrand contacted Keely to do it because he had been in Cleveland, and Keely had done the Cleveland Cathedral, so when he got to be bishop up in Burlington, he got a hold of Keely and said, come on up. And the same way with, why did Keely do Portland? Because the Bishop Bacon in Portland married Patrick Keely and Sarah Farmer. So all these things are interconnected, and then he did that to do other churches. But the Burlington Cathedral, the spire was never finished, and the second bishop up there wasn't feeling well. And he took a trip over to Lourdes, and the spire hadn't been finished, and he promised Our Lady that he would finish the spire if he regained his health. And he said he would crown the spire with a statue of Our Lady of Lourdes. So he came back, his health improved, he finished not a spire, but an open tower area, but on top was like a 19-foot zinc metal statue of Our Lady of Lourdes. And the bishop had installed in the tower the Lord's hymn, Immaculate Mary. And it would play each hour, much to the chagrin of all the Protestant churches in Vermont, because that's still an early time up there. It's before 1900, and it really rankled them that they have to listen to this Catholic hymn, especially to Mary being played every day. And they were really annoyed. Well, we flip up to 1970s. I don't know, I think it's 1974, 73 will begin the story. There was a young fellow that went to the grammar school there, and he loved to be around the church. We'll call his name, because he was Irish, we'll call it Patty, which is probably unfair to anybody that has Patrick in their name like I do, but we'll say Patty just for the sake of it. And he began helping the rector there all the time. And then he went to high school. And he was there lots more, and he wanted to be a priest so bad. But he didn't have the mental capacity to be a priest. So the rector at the time was a very kind man. And so how this ever came to be, he would let him don priest vestments when nobody was around. He did chores, he was a janitor for the cathedral, did chores. He would come out when nobody was around, light the candles on the altar, and pretend to say Mass. Mass would be over, he'd take off the vestments, go back to his things. Seems very odd to us, but the pastors let him do what they let him do. The pastor died. A new rector came into the cathedral up in New Hampshire, Vermont, Burlington, Vermont. And he didn't know this was going on. And he came into the church one day and he saw him and he said, "What in the name of God are you doing? Take those vestments off, get out of here, you're fired, never come back into this building." Well, the guy was devastated. He had been there since grammar school. This was his life every day, coming here, taking care of it, doing everything. He was just devastated. But he didn't have a good mental capacity. It was a March night, a very cold night. I want to say maybe the 21st of 1974. Whatever possessed him, in those days churches were open. He came back in when he knew the church was empty, and he set fire to the confessional curtains. The fire spread unabated. When it was discovered, it was out of control. The firemen could do nothing. The church, the cathedral, was consumed. The tower stood with the statue of Our Lady of Lourdes on top. Nobody knew what happened. The next day, he went down to the firemen and started bragging to the firemen, I know how it started. I started it. Oh, God. He didn't go to jail. He went to an institute of some kind. There was nothing left but the walls. It was worse than when St. Patrick's burned. So it had to come down. It was a problem. The Lourdes hymn no longer played. As the crane came, a giant crane like you see around today, to remove the statue, to take and put down in the back, they were going to make a shrine. They removed the statue from the top of the tower. The Protestant churches in Burlington played Immaculate Mary. Now, isn't that ironic? They were annoyed, but in the end, they kind of came to the rescue. So there's lots of interesting stories. I hope I didn't bore you to death. You got something out of it, but I hope you have some questions. You need to move around. Man, I need to move around. But I'll tell you one last thing. It was funny when Dave got up here and he said, we'll now take up a collection. And this is apropos because it's in November and it's Kennedy's 50th anniversary of his assassination. In January, they had Mozart's Requiem at the Cathedral in Boston. And the Harvard Glee Club and the Radcliffe Glee Club and the Boston Symphony came. They were all set up on platforms there, and Jackie was in the first pew with the Kennedys and everything like that. But they were practicing the night before, and Cardinal Cushing came over. And they sang beautifully, and everything went well. And they saw Cushing in the sanctuary, and he got up and he started walking over to the microphone, and he leaned over. And they all thought he was going to have some great words of wisdom about Kennedy or the event. And he said, exactly as Dave said, we'll now take up the collection. Well, there was a pause for a minute, and everybody burst out laughing because it kind of, and that's a knack that people have. Cardinal O'Malley has it too, to make people feel at ease because everybody was so tense. The eyes of the United States and the world via television were on this Mass. I remember watching it, the beginning of it at home, and then we had to come up to Boston to get some vestments for a friend that was going to be a priest that year. But so that's, I think it's the interesting stories about Keely and the other things that make these things. I can tell you about the windows. They're made by Tyrolean Glass Art. Tyrolean Glass Art did these back in probably 1903, had to be 1906, 1907. They were in business right up until the late 1980s. The father had died and the son took it over. But they had made money doing church glass, but other art glass, replacing all the churches that were destroyed in Germany after World War II. The son had a Maserati or something. He was the president then. His father's old and infirm. He came around a corner, went off a cliff. He got killed. Boom. Now, the interesting thing about these windows here, when they were made before World War I. Franz Mayer was another big company that made German windows. I know Gabriel Meyer that carries on the firm today. They do mosaics for the subways in New York. That's how they make their money. But they do restoration of church windows, which is, as you can see from Father said, it's very expensive. Franz Meyer had 500 artists working in different capacities, statuary, stations, lacrosse. These stations, not the frame around them, but the stations are Meyer of Munich stations. I can tell you the model number. They're model 18A. They're in the catalog from the 1898. Now, they're not plaster, interesting enough. They're what they called terracotta. But they're like a hard paper mache. And I know this because I have one from St. Peter's in Lowell. And if you look at the picture that shows the station of the cross of St. Peter's, the station is all deteriorated. The frame is, but the station isn't. And when they put them up, they put tar on the back of the terracotta, then a huge piece of tin, and put them to the wall, because we didn't have heat like we have today. So the cold coming through wouldn't deteriorate them. So they're Franz Meyer. But about back to the windows, they had 500 artists doing all kinds of things. The portraiture painting, which are the faces, the drapery, the fancy work that you see on it, most of the workers were conscripted into the Kaiser's army, the males, and the majority were killed. So a lot of the companies like Franz Meyer, TGA, never reached the high quality of these windows. So that's why the design of windows changed. Like the windows in Immaculate are very different. They're much newer. And in other churches, if they put newer windows in, they were totally different. But these are, and you see the same windows in different churches. But what they had was they would have a cartoon, and they would show, the priest would say, well, I want the multiplication of loaves and fishes. I want the Sermon on the Mount. I want the flight into Egypt. I want the Annunciation. And they would adapt it to whether it was either 2 lights, that's 2 sections, or 3 lights. This one up here has 5 lights. And the one in back is St. Patrick. And that has 3 lights. And this one up here has 3 large lights. So the windows here, the windows are extraordinary. The marble work is extraordinary. The woodwork, most likely done by Welch on Merrimack Street, and I can show you the paper with it on, for the Cathedral in Boston. It's really superior work. The murals are by Gustav Kinkelin. He did work at St. Peter's. He did work at St. Joseph's, which is probably painted over. He did work at St. John Baptiste. If you remember St. John Baptiste, the murals that were in there, they have all been painted now, I think aqua, some color like that. And it's a crime because they're teaching tools. I teach little kids. You get little kids to come into a building like this, they're mesmerized by the windows, by the Stations of the Cross, by the altars, by the statuary. That's where your faith came from, looking at these things. You know, it's nice to have the ideal of up here and everything's plain. You go into a bank, it's the same thing. Give me a question, I'll see if I can answer it.